Oh, well, hello there, and welcome back. Um, so, our next discussion is about the history of, of cultural anthropology and in anthropology in general. So, I start this out with anthropology. I think it's important to recognize the historical context in which anthropology has developed from, our own history as a field. And it hasn't always been great. We've made mistakes. And I think that's one of the important things to recognize is historical legacy, especially when it comes to science, um, where we can look at the things that has happened in the past, especially within our own field, recognize the mistakes and failures that we've had, and then build upon those without trying to hide or, um, you know, throw away that part of our history, ignore it or sweep it underneath the carpet. We have to look at it, engage it, understand it, appreciate it for what it is, um, and then make progress, right, as a field. Because we were not always great. And we'll talk about some of this um, here in a few minutes. Okay, so, yes, there we go. Our evolution as a field has come quite a long way. So one of the things that we try and battle as anthropologists is this concept of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is sort of the concept that you think that your culture is better than all other cultures. And granted, when we think about American culture, it is typically fairly ethnocentric, right? We have been taught from a very young age, and most cultures are. Okay, let's get this straight. Most cultures are ethnocentric. Um, but using ourselves as an example here, we believe that the United States is the best. Right? Everything that we do is the right way of doing things, and that everyone else should follow us for the most part. We're the richest and the most powerful and all these things. And what anthropology tries to look at is trying to not take that point of view, right? If we look at the United States, we can see that there are issues that we're dealing with. And there might be other cultures, other communities that deal with those particular problems better than we do. And how do we address those issues? How do we look at those things and learn from those things? So it's not about being anti-patriotic or anything like that, but it's recognizing the things that could be better, right? So we try and look at ethnocentrism as a negative thing, because we don't want to have that sort of like overarching idea when we look at those other cultures. We don't want to sort of put those things down. We'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things that we have worked with in the past is this concept of social Darwinism. Okay, social Darwinism is this idea that the evolutionary, biological evolution of a group of people is directly related to their culture. Okay, so the more culturally advanced you are, the more evolved as a human you are, right? So, as an example, right, if we're talking about, say, Western Europe, right, or the United States, we have all this technology, right? We have all of this capability of going into space and doing all of this stuff. We would say that culturally we are superior. And this concept of social Darwinism takes it one step further and says that because culturally and technologically we are superior, we are biologically superior. Now, if we go to, say, Tanzania, and we go out into the tribal lands, and we find people that are living in mud huts as they have lived in these same sort of mud huts for thousands of years. We look at them and say, well, their technology is, poor. So they must also biologically be poor, right? Maybe they're not as evolved as we are because they don't have the same technology, the same tools. And that is patently untrue, right? Biologically, they're just as capable. But this has been one of those practices, one of those beliefs, and a reason that people have been able to justify behavior or legislature around using people for different means, right? If we go back to the age of slavery in the United States, if you can tell me, if you can justify scientifically that African Americans were less culturally developed, so less biologically developed, so they're not as human, then you can justify slavery, right? Because you're not enslaving humans, right? You're enslaving less than humans. So you can find this reason, and anthropology had a part in this, right? It had a part at justifying behavior, and that's not good, right? That's a part of our history that we have to acknowledge and then move on. An example of this, we're going to talk about Otabanga and the Bronx Zoo. So Otabanga was a pygmy from and was bought by Samuel Werner. And Samuel Werner was an anthropologist, and in 1904 was in Africa and found these slave traders and bought this individual and brought him back to the United States. And first was in St. Louis, placed in an exhibit, and then eventually was moved to the Bronx Zoo. And in the Bronx Zoo, he had his own enclosure, right? And he was situated right next to the gorillas and to the chimpanzees and the orangutans. And during open hours, he was allowed to, he was restricted to his enclosure. He was on display. And then after the zoo was closed, he was allowed to walk around the rest of the zoo, which, that was nice of him, right? Nice of the zoo to be able to let him walk around and, see all the other animals, right? Because that's how he was being treated, was this is not a human being. This is something to be put on display. At the time, this was seen in two different ways. Samuel Werner was awarded gold medals for science for doing this. Won medals, right? Was recognized as a hero in the scientific realm. We know this is wrong, right? We currently know that this is a terrible idea. But we have to recognize that historically, science and scientists were dealing with what they knew of at the time. And this was seen as a scientific win. We have to recognize those things. We have to take on that legacy and responsibility for these things so that we can learn from them and make sure that this kind of stuff never happens again. His story ends up that enough people protested that he was eventually released. Right? He was eventually released. Ended up working at a tobacco plantation and worked there for a couple years, and then decided that he wanted to go home, which, yeah, I'd want to go home too. And that was at the onset of World War I. And because of World War I, and because he wasn't able to travel home, he ended up committing suicide. And it's absolutely tragic that this happened to this individual in the name of science, in the name of anthropology. So we have to see this, we have to recognize it, and we have to deal with it. Right? This is a part of our history. Let us not forget it. So because of things like this, right, because of these different ideas, people saw the need for a change, right? So here comes Franz Boas and Bronislaw Malinowski, and they are sort of the founding members of like American and British anthropology. And they start talking about these concepts like cultural relativism. And when Boas was living with the Inuit, he was doing research and was living with the Inuit along the Arctic Circle. And this is what he came to learn. He learned that as an individual, if he were to try and go out and live along the Arctic Circle, if anyone from his community had tried to live along the Arctic Circle, they would die probably within days, if not weeks. But the Inuit, they survived for millennia. And Boas was curious about this because technologically, they were far behind Europe. But culturally and technologically, they were perfectly situated for where they lived. They were very successful where they lived. They were able to not only survive, but thrive within that environment. And what Boas came to realize is that, guess what? I guess that if we look at this culture, and if I were to just try and move in, I would end up dying. We can't necessarily compare these two different cultures. They're perfectly situated for where they are and what they're capable of doing. And so they can't be looked down upon because they are perfectly successful for what they're doing. And started thinking about other cultures like that too, realizing that the people that were living out in the Sahara, living lives as nomads, they weren't any less human than someone that was living in metropolitan Paris. They just had different survival skills than someone that was living in metropolitan Paris, right? You have to have skills to survive, whether it is a labor, or it is family, or it is a job, or whatever. Or it's hunting and gathering your resources. You're basically doing the same thing, you're just doing it differently, right? So this idea is that cultural relativism took out the sort of the we're better than this culture or worse than this culture, and said these cultures, we can compare them and contrast them, but they're not unequal. They're equal in their own ways, and we should respect those cultures for that. So we just talked about this. We'll continue on. And if you want to pause and look at this, go ahead. Okay, so now we're going to talk about globalism. What is globalism? Essentially, globalism is the integration of communication, transportation, and environmental and economic infrastructures. It is also the migration or immigration of peoples around the world and the availability and capability of doing so. Okay, what does that mean? Well, globalization is the movement of information, it's the movement of people, it's the movement of goods. And the easier it becomes to move those things around. So as globalization has increased, our world has basically shrunk, right? We go back 100 years, if I wanted to get to, say, Kenya, it might take me 2 months of travel to get there, right? I'd have to take a steamer, right? A ship that'll sail to Africa, and then I've got to probably sail down south along the western coast, go around the Cape, go back up half the way, and Africa's big, right? That's going to take some time to do. Or I could travel across Africa, but they didn't have highways and cars like we do. So transportation might have been, right, a real long time to get there. Now, well, when I traveled to Kenya a few years ago, it was 32 hours by plane. Not bad. If I wanted to communicate with someone 100 years ago, I'd have to write a letter and then send that letter. Well, mail wasn't particularly good. It might take weeks, maybe even months, for that letter to get to its destination. When I was in Kenya, I had this thing called a cell phone. And I'd open up that cell phone, I'd dial the number, and then I could talk to my sister or my mom here in the United States, and I could do it live. It's absolutely amazing, right? How globalization has changed. And we'll talk about that throughout the semester as to why and how it's changed. It has allowed us to become much more dynamic. So how has this impacted anthropology? Well, it allows us to travel, right? Before, again, go back 100 years, there's a chance that if I were to go to another country and I wanted to study a particular people, I might have to live with those people maybe even for years. I might get on a ship, sail to someplace, and then I might not see another ship come to that port for another 2 years. So I had to live there and be there and learn the language and be part of that community. Now it's super easy, right? Hop on a plane, I can go someplace for a couple of weeks, do some study, go back home, go back, go home, go back, go home, talk to people through like FaceTime, through Facebook, right? Across 10,000 miles and have live interactions. So when we look at all of these things, when we look at the process in which communication, in which people travel, we can look at different ways in which we can use those new techniques to study people. You can use Facebook to do ethnographies, right? You can watch people that, say we take a village from Mexico, and in this village, half of their GDP comes from the United States. People that are living in the United States sending money back to that village, and half of the money that comes into that village is coming from the United States. So we might wonder why, what's happening here? Well, let's say that a couple people, we'll start with a couple people, they moved to say like Chicago. And in Chicago they got good jobs. And so they started sending money back to their community, to their parents and to their family. And then that money was able to go to other people, right? Through, we've got more money, we can buy more goods. And then those people that were selling those goods could buy more and better goods. And then that sort of filters through that community. And then that allowed, now there's somebody here in Chicago, and it creates a corridor for people to go from this little village to Chicago to get more jobs. And then now you've got more people that are moving back and forth. And you've got resources moving back and forth between that. And we can see that because people are on Facebook and they're talking to each other and they're posting things about their lives and sharing those conversations because Facebook is, everywhere. Right? So that's one of the ways that we can study people through technology and through things like social networks. So we've got all these things, right? We've got smartphones, we've got satellites, we've got easy transportation, all of these things. And how we record that information now is also changing. Before, anthropologists, everything was handwritten or drawn, right? And then we got cameras. Then we got video cameras or cinematic cameras. And now we've got, smartphones, right, where we can record everything. So the technology for us has changed dramatically in how we can also be more capable of telling a greater story, not just from the perspective of one person, but actually allow people to see what they're learning about. We can own property on different continents, right? We can, people can, in the United States, can buy foreign property. People from other countries can buy property here in the United States, right? We can see and track major migration patterns or immigration patterns as people are moving from one place to another for one reason or another, whether it's economic, whether they are being pushed from a location, so economic issues or environmental catastrophes, and they're like, I lost my home, I need someplace to go, and so they leave, right? Or they see opportunity. Hey, I want my children to have a better opportunity, better education, better chance at life, so we're going to immigrate there. Or in the case of like migration, I can go over here, I can travel across borders, get a job, work, and then when the job is done, go home, right? And bring that money back home where my family can use it, right? So we can look at those different reasons why people are traveling and going to new places. How has it affected? We look at how it has affected the world around us, right? How people are changing, how we're growing in population, and what kind of an impact is that having on the world? And how is our perception of the world changing? Like I said before, we would spend years working within a specific community. Now we can split that up, right? We don't have to spend entire amounts of time in those communities. We can travel, right? We can spend seasons in different places. And then we can also look at how those cultures are impacting each other, right? The acculturation of one culture into the next. If we look at American culture and how American culture gets pushed out throughout the entire world, we can see how that culture is being adapted, right? When I was in Kenya, right, I was in Mombasa, and in Mombasa, everywhere, right, it was Americanized, and I'd go out there and I'd be looking for a tuk-tuk, right? Tuk-tuk is like a three-wheeled motorcycle cab, right? So anywhere I wanted to get to in town, I'd hail a tuk-tuk, and guy'd pull up, I'd hop in the back seat, and then he'd take off. On the back of every single tuk-tuk that I saw there, it would say like Beyonce, or Shaq, or the Red Hot Chili Peppers. On all of these things. And you would hear American music everywhere, in every restaurant. You would see American clothing. You would see, I kid you not, I saw Broncos memorabilia while I was in Kenya. And I was like, whoa, wow, how did this get here? right? So we see how culture gets pushed out there or is drawn in to a place. And we want to understand the mechanisms behind that. We understand there's 8 billion people on the planet today, right? And there are, for the most part, many of them are connected. And how do we share that information, right? As we get connected in more and more ways, how does that influence us? How does that influence them, right? And we're seeing sort of the integrations of corporations. How do corporations expand into new places? And what kind of an impact does that have on a community, right? Even like tourism. You know, what happened in Maui, where residents were saying, hey, tourists, don't come here, right? We don't need you here. We need to deal with this. We need to deal with what's happening, you know. So, because even like natural events, such as an eruption or a wildfire can create a draw for tourism. So tourism has an impact. How does it have that impact? What's going to happen to those people? We want to understand why. And communities that were once bound to one location are now capable of moving and learning more things or being taken over by a more dominant culture. And so we have to understand those mechanisms. Okay. So something I want you guys to think about. Again, another exercise. You obviously can't break up into groups, but I want you to think real quick about what are the benefits of globalism? What are some of the things that we have benefited from? And then think about some of the drawbacks. So take a few minutes, write down both of these. What are the benefits? What are the drawbacks? All right. So pause. And then come back. Okay, so hopefully you're back. And let's talk about some of these. Well, we already talked about some. Let's talk about some of those things, right? As far as benefits, we can see that we can learn new information. We can get resources. Any of you ever thought about why we can get bananas in December? That's a benefit, right? We can get bananas in December. Are there any banana trees around here that we can locally get bananas? Of course not, right? But through globalization, we can do that. At the same time, the transport, refrigeration, energy used to transport bananas from another country to the entire North American realm, right? How many bananas do you need that goes into every single supermarket? How many supermarkets do you know of in your town, right? All of them have bananas. All of them get fresh bananas. It's bananas, right? It takes effort to get those bananas there. So the benefit is that we have bananas. The drawback is, what is the cost of getting those bananas there, right? And that's with all commodities. You know, there's a drawback. There's transportation. That transportation takes fuel. The chemicals that are needed to make sure that they don't ripen too early, that they ripen in the store, right? How fast do we have to get those bananas onto the shelves? How long does it take between harvest and transport to delivery? These are logistical issues, right? And those logistical issues are directly related to globalism. Okay, so let's talk about all of this. So what does this mean? When we think about anthropology in general, we're looking at going out and how we do research and the complications and historical complications and the things that we need to look at. Part of it is the fact that we can no longer look at localized communities. We also have to look at neighboring communities as well, right? We're no longer isolated, right? So we have to take that holistic approach. We have to include their neighbors. We have to include trading partners. We have to include immigration and migration patterns. We have to look at those natural resources and who they share that with. We have to look at both near and far cultures that affect a local community. If I'm looking at the Ute Mountain tribe, who I've worked with in the past, if I look at them and say, okay, I want to study you, but if I want to study you, I also need to understand your relationship between Cortez, which is their nearest neighbors to the north, and that's primarily a white populated town. And then I want to look at their relationship to the Navajo, who is to their south. And once I start looking at those connections, I can start to see the interactions and a more in-depth look at the identity of the Ute tribe, because they're not isolated, right? They have these interactions. What are those interactions like? What are the good things? What are the bad things? How are things changing? We also have to understand that there's no such thing as a static culture. Culture is always changing. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's really slow. It depends on that community, right? If we look at American culture is rapidly changing, constantly and consistently changing, right? But if we go to a remote part of the world that doesn't have a lot of outside influence, that culture might stay pretty much similar as to the way that they've lived for millennia, right? There's going to be some change as something new is brought in, but it might not be real quick to change. So we have to know that things are never static, right? Things are always constantly changing. It just depends on the degree of change. We're there to see the change and try to understand it and help others deal with those changes. We want to understand and help create bridges of understanding between different populations. Okay? And we want to understand a holistic approach to how the world works. How do we see all of these different components come together to make things work? That's what we're trying to accomplish. Okay, that's it. So, you've got a exam that you will be able to take on the subject that we just discussed. So take that at your convenience. It is open book. It take as much time as you need. There's no time limit on the exam. And I want to thank you guys for sitting through this. And hopefully you're finding some interesting things that are going to help you along this path. All right, we'll get the next module up and going here next week. And hopefully we'll be getting most of them out before the next month or so. We should have most of them done. So you'll be able to take a little bit more time to look at each module at your own pace. Okay, good luck, and take it easy. And if you can't take it easy, take it any way you can. And we'll see you next time. All right.